Hi, let's talk about resilience. In the late 1990s, there was a popular song by Baz Luhrmann that was written in the form of a graduation address, a speech to a graduating class. And one of the pieces of advice that Luhrmann offers is, and I quote, don't worry about the future, or worry, but know that worrying is as effective as trying to solve an algebra problem by chewing bubble gum. The real problems in your life are apt to be things that never crossed your mind, the kind that blindside you at 4 p.m. on some idle Tuesday. I think that is incredibly sound advice. And the theory we're going to talk about, the communication theory of resilience, attempts to understand how we use communication in those moments when life blindsides us on an idle Tuesday. The narratives of our lives are constantly marked, sadly, by disruptions. Some disruptions can be absolutely wonderful, like a phone call from a social worker on a Thursday afternoon changed my life 18 years ago when I learned that I would have the opportunity to foster the child that eventually became my oldest daughter. But a lot of the disruptions that we encounter are challenging, problematic, negative. Life happens, and sometimes the life that happens isn't pretty. Some of you know that I've done a considerable amount of research working with men who have lived experience of prostate cancer. Imagine being a person in a healthy romantic relationship, a long term marriage, and receiving that phone call from your doctor saying, I need you to come in and we need to talk about your test results, and you should bring your wife with you. Out of the blue, 4 o'clock, some idle Tuesday or Thursday or Wednesday or whenever. Resilience happens to us in lots of ways. People lose jobs. Um, Global pandemics shake up the entire world. One of the things that we are doing as individuals in trying to make sense of our lives on this big blue marble is to deal with those moments, those disruptions, and to try to find ways to, I don't want to use the word cope, but we'll get to that, but to deal with those situations. The main theorists behind the communication theory of resilience, a scholar named Patrice Buzzanel, who is currently at the University of South Florida, go Bulls, but started this work during her time as a faculty member at Purdue University. Buzzanel takes an interesting stance, a complicated stance towards this concept of resilience because she brings in concepts that are relevant to a wide range of scholars, methodologically speaking, from the hardcore scientists to from the hardcore scientists to the hardcore interpretivists to the critical scholars. And let's talk about why. What she argues at its core in the theory is that resilience, this idea of what resilience is actually the result of communication processes. That's why it's a communication theory. So for her, resilience isn't just the ability to pick yourself up, dust yourself off, and start all over again, to use another song lyric that probably dates me. Um, but for her, resilience is a series of processes that allow us to generate a new sense of the new normal that we create in the wake of those disruptions. Now, some disruptions are bigger than others. I mean, a cancer diagnosis is a pretty extreme one, but there are lots of other extreme disruptions. And what matters is that those disruptions hold significance for the people experiencing them, no matter how large or small we may perceive them to be. Um, when my, oh gosh, if my 16-year-old daughter comes home and tells me that she has suffered a breakup with her boyfriend, I might think of that as part of the normal life cycle. She may think her world is coming to an end. And so she needs to develop a sense, she needs to develop the tools for resilience, and we'll get there. Okay. In relationships, we see the need for resilience often because there are lots of contexts in which disruptions can occur. A health crisis, to use R.D. Laing's idea from the classic book, The Politics of the Family. When an illness crisis strikes a member of the family, it becomes a social crisis, a family crisis, because what's wrong with that one person, in a way, becomes what's wrong with the entire family. So when one person is diagnosed with prostate cancer, for instance, and yes, I will return to that example, um, when that happens, it impacts the entire family, and it impacts all the relationships in that family. Um, for those of you who don't know, your prostate, guys, your prostate produces about 60% of the fluid in your semen. If something goes wrong with your prostate because of its location right behind the rectum, you're probably looking at some serious urinary and sexual function problems. And those things, well, could certainly affect a relationship. A couple who had a fairly regular and vigorous intimate relationship might find that their relationship is challenged when that doesn't happen anymore. When prostate cancer, its treatments uh, or its direct effects prevent that from happening the way it once did. Well, what Buzzanell argues is that we generate resilience by using the discursive and the material resources at our disposal. That in order to come up with this idea, in order for us to craft this new normal and for us to proceed, uh, we need to be aware of and take advantage of the resources at our disposal. And this is where some critical researchers are particularly interested in the communication theory of resilience because, well, we don't all come to the table with the same set of resources. For many years in multiple settings, I have worked with support groups for men living with prostate cancer. Um, but conducting that kind of work in a small, fairly well-to-do retirement community in Florida, where everyone in that community has access to the support group, is a different experience from, say, doing that while working with a support group in a hospital in Lexington, Kentucky, um, an area where many of the patients don't have regular access to the support groups, where the groups, for instance, may be meeting physically once or twice a month, but most of the men can't make that trip because most of the men don't live in Lexington. Uh, Here's your lesson in Kentucky geography. Kentucky is Lexington and Louisville, two cities, and then 100 counties of farmland. There are a lot of people in Kentucky who can't get to a doctor within an hour and a half. And so those people might not have the same resources in terms of access to medical care or support group that some others do. We'll get to that in more detail soon. But resilience is a communication practice whereby we use those resources. And those resources are different for everyone. Perish the thought, if I were diagnosed with prostate cancer, I would have at the ready a network of experts that I could call for medical opinions. I would have a network of social support experts I could talk with. And I'm well aware that not everyone has those resources. As a consequence, I have allowed myself to become such a resource for some other people been who've been diagnosed and who are dealing with that diagnosis. Okay. So we have these discursive practices, these communicative practices. What do they look like? Well, here's one of the strengths of the theory. Um, Here's where a scientific theorist would look at Busnell's work and say it passes one particular criterion for a good theory. It's a pretty parsimonious one because she argues that we do this in 5 steps, that there are 5 elements to the process of generating resilience. And those 5 are interrelated. First on that list is the crafting of a new normal. When disruption changes things, it often changes things in a way that is irreparable, where there is no going back. People who study illness narratives talk about a type of narrative that they call the chaos narrative, where illness comes along, wrecks our lives, and we'll never be the same again. But we can't wallow in that. We need to find a new way to make sense of what's happening. Um, I immediately think of the men I've spoken with over the years who are faced with the challenges to their intimate relationships with their partners that come from the disruption of the cancer diagnosis and cancer treatment. So, for many of these men, one of the side effects of the disease and of the treatment, depending on the options chosen, is erectile dysfunction. Um, if, for instance, if the cancer has spread far enough, it may be necessary to perform an orchiectomy to remove uh, the testicles. Uh, Removing the prostate is certainly an option as well. But in many of those cases, well, if you have no testicles, all the Viagra in the world isn't going to do a bit of good. So, what do we do in that relationship when you have a partner who wants an intimate relationship with you and you still want an intimate relationship with that partner? There's a need to craft a new normal. And in one of the examples that immediately springs to mind, um, I think of an older couple who told me that they decided that they were going to go dancing 3 nights a week instead. That they had decided that their new normal wasn't going to include sex, but it was still going to include intimacy because that's what mattered to them. So they decided to craft a new normal, a communicative action where they're going out dancing, they're engaging in nonverbal communication. This is the time that they spend physically close to each other. We're talking space, a form of nonverbal count. They're touching each other, haptics. Again, nonverbal communication. Here is a way to craft a new normal. A second type, a second one of those 5 steps is kind of an attitude shift. A shift from focusing on the negative aspects of the disruption. It doesn't mean ignoring them altogether, but it means shift. In the second step, we shift to a focus on productive action. So moving from woe is me to, okay, what can I do? I know that my agency is limited. I can't make this thing go away. I may not be able to return things to normal, but what is within my power to do? Simply put, we're directing our energy more towards positive action than towards the kind of stationary act of just worrying. The third step is about identity. We need to affirm what Buzzanell calls identity anchors. We need to find ways to remind ourselves of who we are. These men, for instance, needed to be reminded that they were valued members of their community, that they were good husbands, that they were hard workers, that they were good fathers. And so, for a lot of those we'll see an overlap to the next state to the next step here. For a lot of those people, those identity anchors were those other people. So interacting with those other people, reminiscing about those things, served as reminders that they weren't any less of a man because of this diagnosis. That they weren't, excuse me, that they hadn't changed in the grand sense of who they were. Now, here we see a link to the fourth step in that process of generating resiliency, and that is taking advantage of communication networks. For some, in the case of a group of prostate cancer survivors, it might be that group of support, that social support group, that formal group that meets at the hospital or at a community center or at a church regularly to discuss their concerns and talk about strategies they've employed to help them in coping. For other people, it can be a lot less formal than that. Sometimes we help strengthen those communication networks simply by engaging in a Facebook check every once in a while, just popping in on somebody you haven't heard from in a while just to make sure they're okay. Um, a friend of mine had a surgery not too long ago, and come to think of it, I just over the weekend dropped her a line to check in and see how she was doing. That's a part of the communication element of generating resiliency. Now, the last one, in a lot of ways, will sound like narrative reframing for those of you who are fans of those narrative based theories. Buzzanell refers to them as alternative logics, but it really is about generating a new perspective. And those of us who study narrative believe that narrative is a primary means of doing that. I immediately think of one of the group members who was diagnosed with cancer, and he said that what he said was that after he thought about it for a while he allowed himself to be sad about it, took a deep breath and talked with his wife, and came to the conclusion that this was something that was supposed to happen to them. He told me that he believed that God gave him this along with a responsibility to serve as a role model for other men going through similar experiences. So he and his wife became kind of health experts in their church community. They became people to whom friends and strangers in the church, for that matter, could approach to talk with about health crises that were affecting them. And not every case is going to allow you. Not every case might allow you to use the alternative logic that this disruption was an act of God, literally in this case, as that couple framed it. But nevertheless, Buzzanell says that it's important for us to try to be open to new logics, to creating new stories about how and why things happen. My wife and I struggled to have a child for many years. Eventually became foster parents and adopted. And the alternative logic we have employed is that we had the children we were supposed to have. We eventually had a biological child too. I think I've mentioned that. But it required a reframing of the dominant kind of cultural narrative about how marriage and family are supposed to work in this nice linear order and with these bloodlines involved throughout. No, we employed alternative logic whereby our family was always destined to be unique, given the unique combination of people that my wife and I are. Okay, so in a nutshell, we have Buzzanell's attempt to look at the complex and messy idea of disruptions to our life stories, to our relationships. And her answer to how we deal with that is through generating resilience, through these discursive, through the use of our discursive and material resources. Now, as a strength of the theory, it's a fairly parsimonious one. I mean, we can talk about this in terms of 5 parts. And a theory that can say as much as possible in as few parts as possible and with as few variables as possible is a parsimonious or elegant theory. And 5 is pretty doggone good. It is a versatile theory. It's applicable to lots of relationship contexts because so many things can be disruptions in relationships, and so many different relationships can be disrupted in so many ways. But there also becomes a possible critique of the theory. Some might argue that it is so general, that it is so broad in its potential, that at the other end, it's really hard to get to those scientific researchers' goals of prediction, explanation, and control. So it's a theory that has some value for scientific researchers and probably a little more for interpretive researchers and probably just as much, if not more, for critical researchers. And that is perfectly fine. Not every theory, in fact, most theories aren't going to satisfy all 3 of those groups. And this is one of the theories that probably comes as close to satisfying the requirements of good theory from all of those people, from many of those people. For instance, the critical theorists want to see theory advocating for social change. Well, one of the things that happens is that when people acknowledge via this theory that people come to the table with different sets of resources, we see a need for resources emerging. So if I'm studying, so for instance, when we were studying cancer experiences during my time at Kentucky, and we found that many people couldn't get to doctors, one of the things that some colleagues and I did was create a grant application to try to establish, this was several years ago, mind you, a telephone hotline. Those people might not have been able to get to the doctor, but they might be able to pick up the phone to talk with someone, to ask any questions they had, to express any concerns they had. Again, this is in the time that it's been in existence, it has probably been one of the more popular communication theories, one of the more popular relational communication theories, not only within family relationships, but within organizational relationships as well. We see organizations constantly beset by disruptions, and they need to establish a new normalcy as well. So, this is a theory that across the board is recognized as a pretty strong theory, though it has some limitations. And it's a theory that has value for interpersonal and family communication and for communication in other contexts.